All righty. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for bearing with me. I was talking a little bit too much offline there and didn't realize we had passed showtime. So, thank you, everybody, for bearing with me and joining us this morning. I hope we can get a good crowd in. I know it's a little bit early, but I know those that don't get to watch live will watch the recast and will thoroughly enjoy it because we've actually gotten a few requests for the gentleman we're going to be covering today. But today we are joined by a prior guest who spoke a little bit about his career in Special Forces with 7th Special Forces Group and his time in Iraq. I don't know if you made it to Afghanistan. Did you? Were you only in Iraq?
Pardon me?
Well, serving in Iraq? Didn't you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, or was it Iraq only?
No, it was El Salvador in the
Oh,
80s, and then Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, when we first went over the Burma.
excellent. Okay, that's what I knew I'd messed up one of our AOs there. But we are joined by Mr. Greg Walker. Mr. Greg is an author and a fierce advocate for the Special Forces, not only for vets getting help with their medical, but also getting enrolled with the SFA and the SOA, which is Special Forces Association, and the Special Operations Association, which is the SOG and Mike Force in the special project side of the Special Forces group. So I'm very excited, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Greg and let him get us started for today. Mr. Greg, floor is yours, sir.
Hey, good morning, Bud. Great to see you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning with everybody and to talk about Mike and his life and the people that were important in his life and his upcoming biography.
Excellent, excellent. Could you kind of lay the groundwork? I'm not sure if you wanted to kind of give a brief description on yourself, a little run through on your bona fides, or if you wanted to just get into telling us a little bit about the origin story of Mr. Mike.
Well, the origin story of Mr. Mike is intertwined with my career. Uh, I entered the service in 1975, initially with 2nd Ranger Battalion, then went down the street to 2nd of the 1st Recon with the 9th Infantry Division. Spent several years there, then went back to Fort Benning and was with B Company, 1st of the 29th Ranger, which was a support unit for the Ranger Department. And that was really interesting because my first sergeant turned out to be the one of the survivors of the ambush that Mike was in, and his name is Eddie Roberts, and we called him. He was called Fast Eddie. He would go on to become inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame. Became a great influence for soldiers and veterans benefits and rights there in the Columbus, Georgia area. But it was Fast Eddie who was the NCOIC in that truck on September 8th, 1978, when they got hit. My introduction to Mike was in 1977 when I was at Pathfinder School at Fort Benning. And I saw my first issue of Soldier of Fortune magazine, which was in the barracks area. And Mike was on the cover. And I read the article and I thought, who is this guy? This guy's got the look, and who is he? So I started following Mike after that in the magazines. I had the opportunity when I was at 2-1 Recon. Tom Downing, who was one of Mike's original instructors at Bragg, was stationed there with the 9th. And he came over and did a week's worth of knives combatives training with us. And after that, I was hooked. He was just an incredibly charismatic, interesting guy. And over the years, and after I ETS'd in 1985, I began to write more and more about Mike in a couple of the magazines I was involved with. And long story short, got introduced to his family over in Ontario, and his mom and I became very, very close friends. And the book, his biography, is the result of that friendship. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I retired in 2005. I spent the rest of my career time with USASVIC and in the reserve programs. I was with Company A, 1st of the 19th, when we went into Kuwait in 02 and then into Iraq in 03. And then I did Iraq again in 04 as a DoD contractor, and then retired in 05. And have been working on Mike's book for now going on 16 years, and we hope to have it finished here and published by the end of this next year.
That's amazing. We're gonna get into a little bit of the early history, but as before we even start, uh, I really came across him first by accident on two total occasions. One, when we first started doing our live interviews, and we were speaking of, or there was a subreddit called JSOC Archives, and it posted, I believe, either Mr. Mike, and that's the next thing that got me, either being run over by the Jeep,
Yeah.
or straight up strangling somebody with a rear naked choke. And I can't remember, I've got the Jeep photo, but I'm gonna pull up a photo of Mr. Mike right here. But I just happened in a Reddit, and someone was talking about the greatest knife fighters, the greatest teachers that Army combatives have had. And some of the newer guys were talking about some of the Gracie guys on the West Coast, especially the SEALs, were talking about the Gracie guys. But Mr. Mike's name came up, and I'd never heard that name. And then someone started talking about, oh, if you're talking about combatives, you should see him with a knife. And I was like, whoa, if he's deadly with his hands and feet and head, Lord knows, guy getting run over by a Jeep that's deadly with a knife, I've got to figure out who this is. And happened upon your YouTube channel, or the YouTube channel for Mr. Mike's memory, of the entire, I believe it's almost 2 hours of the training footage that you found.
Yeah, that is part of what this remarkable journey has been on. Mike, first and foremost, Mike Echanis is the father of modern military combatives, bar none. Others have understandably been involved in the combatives program over the years, and allude to or outright come out and say, I'm the guy that made military combatives for special forces or whatever. It was Mike Echanis, and that video, Mike had written home in 1976 from Bragg, that just a passing comment that he was making a video with the Army of his program, and so that story, that myth, that rumor, has been out there for years in different venues, and nobody could find it. And so it became legendary, but it was like, was this guy, who was this guy? And lo and behold, about 2.5 years ago, I was chatting with Dan Branson, who shares who created the Warriors of the Night Facebook page about Mike, and Dan just happened to mention, the video, and I said, well, boy, I'd sure like to find that, because I've been looking for that forever. And he said, I had a guy down in Florida who sent me an email who said he's got a copy of that, and I just didn't really pay attention to it. And and that. Long story short, he found that email. I linked up with the guy via email, then talked to him on the phone, and sure enough, he is a civilian martial artist. And back in the day, his instructor in Jacksonville had a student who was an instructor under Mike. And his instructor used to take his students up to Fort Bragg to kind of a field trip, if you will, and became involved with that whole program. The video, I believe, is the only surviving copy of that program. It is the raw footage of what they filmed. And when his instructor passed away, he passed that video, who he had gotten from Mike's instructor, who we'll talk about later on to him, and he had it in his secure storage for the last 15 years. And so he said, folks really need to see this, and he was incredibly gracious, a wonderful man. And he sent it to me, and I viewed it, and I was just stunned. It's the only recorded video of Mike Echanis and Chuck Sanders, who was his childhood friend, and just they're yin and yang. Chuck was a Special Forces medic at that time on Jake Jakovenko's 5th Group team. And of course, Jake Jakovenko was a Sante Raider. He's also part of Mike's combatives program at Bragg. And it is the only video that we have where you can hear Mike's voice, you can see what he was teaching. You can see how incredibly good he was as a martial artist. And Dan and I both agreed we're going to put this up online so that anybody who wants to know more about Mike or see Mike in action, and Chuck and that, has the opportunity to do so. Milestone find. It just came out of nowhere. And it's quite the piece, quite the gift.
I first seeing that and sitting through it, and I'm going to link not only the video on YouTube, but I'm also going to link your 2-part series, Wounded Warrior articles from the Sentinel, into the show notes, because tons of great information. And when you were speaking about the infamous or the famous letter, I was quite surprised to see him mention in the letter already there towards the end, talking about he's already been, shall we say, contacted or looked for by, and I believe he worded it, head of counterterrorism, Colonel Beckwith, to begin teaching his students. And I thought that for the colonel to come back and or to come look for you, you've already built a reputation if he's sending his guys to you that early on when Delta's first being stood up.
Yeah, that's that whole aspect of Mike's time after Vietnam and after his miraculous medical recovery is really something. In that case, Colonel Beckwith had stood up Delta, and they were getting ready to do their certification, which is a very big deal, as you well know. And they needed to pass the hand-to-hand combatives. And Mike's program, especially when you look at the video, you can see it. Mike's program was special weapons and tactics as well as combatives. And Beckwith was very aware of him, and at the time was said, we got to pass our combatives training for this certification for this unit. So he went to Mike and asked Mike if Mike would do that, and Mike and Chuck did do that, and trained the original first generation Delta operators up in real deal combatives. And when they came time to be tested and evaluated, they brought in some local Taekwondo instructors and a couple of other folks to grade them. And two things happened. One, they passed with flying colors, and two, the evaluators, the Taekwondo people on that said, "We've never seen anything like this ever." And so he was the first guy to put Delta on the map. And what's interesting is that Beckwith talks about this in his book on Delta. He doesn't mention Mike by name, but he does talk about how important it was that they passed that certification, and does talk about the hand-to-hand program. And so that's a pretty interesting thing.
It absolutely is. Oh, I've got some terrible feedback. I apologize, but if y'all can see on screen, he is going through the taking a sentry down silently. I mean, I'll link this in the show notes, because it's going through all parts. He ends up breaking out his ninja stars, his nunchucks, his any knife you can imagine. He gets out, and I believe the Jeep is at the very beginning. I got to say, that's one of the most interesting parts, because he has got a Army issue Jeep just right there parked on top of him, and it is. I mean, he was an absolute stud. And to get to kind of where we're going to be going here, to what made him this, I'll go ahead and say it, almost superhero-esque figure in the community. He had a very, and we're going way back here because I found it very interesting. His initial introduction, or even finding out about martial arts, wasn't it from was he an Easy Company vet, Mr. Chick Kime?
Oh, Chick? Yeah, actually, Mike's introduction. Mike grew up in Ontario, Oregon, and I want to point out that the demonstrator in the clip you just showed, that's Chuck Sanders.
Okay.
And Chuck Sanders, equally as interesting, very quiet. They were yin and yang, and grew up together, had all sorts of adventures together. They died together down in Nicaragua. But Chuck was a very accomplished martial artist, and the folks I talked to include Jake Jakovenko, said that in truth, where Mike was phenomenal, Chuck was flat scary. And I go into the book how Chuck was brought up in Ontario, and who his dad was, and his martial arts training and everything. Chuck was described as just cold as ice when it came to having to get down or get it on. So they were quite the duo. And Mike's introduction to martial arts is twofold. One, when he was 14 years old, Chick Kime, who was a combat veteran from the Band of Brothers, had moved back to Ontario and had married Mike's aunt. And so he came to know Chick, and he asked Chick to teach him how the paratroopers fought in the unit that he was in. And Chick did. And just really enjoyed Mike. He also taught Mike how to scuba dive and do a number of other things. I met Chick several years before he passed away. Just a phenomenal guy, and much loved by the Echanis family. And the other aspect of it was in Ontario at the time, jiu-jitsu, judo was being taught at the Oregon, Idaho Judo Club. and all the young dudes would, there wasn't a lot to do in Ontario. Ended up, taking judo, and Chuck was studying, and then Mike asked to study, so he trained in judo initially, and that was one of his core arts. So you have this guy at a very young age. His whole family had a military background. His dad and his uncles, World War II, etc. And Chuck's dad was a surgeon in the Marine Corps during the Pacific campaign. And when he came back to the States and got out, he became a doctor, obviously, and was very well respected there in Ontario. And it was also the sports doctor for the Ontario Tigers. And so this whole interaction and interplay of personalities and backgrounds really came into focus. And Mike just continued to study the arts up until the time of his death.
I was very surprised. Well, not really surprised about seeing how proficient he was as a judo. And if you just saw the footage that we just watched, that was a judo throw that he did right there, and it was flawless. I'm really liking to see he seems to not be satisfied with just one art. It seemed like he wanted to be as game as he could be with every possible instrument of self-defense or offense that he could learn.
Yeah, and that really goes back to the reason that he enlisted and went to Vietnam and volunteered for Charlie Ranger, and then of course his horrific wounding, and leading up to his recovery, and then his decision that he was going to become a trainer for the military, as well as a professional martial artist. And his becoming a professional martial artist is tied again to Ontario, when he and Chuck met a very young man who came over from Japan to teach judo at the junior college there. And Chuck introduced Mike to him, and they became very close, very fast friends. And this was after Mike's wounding and his recovery, which was ongoing up until the time of his death. And the two of them just synced up, and Mike said, "I want to be a professional martial artist like this guy," and off they went. But it's really rooted in what happened to him in Vietnam, and then his emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical recovery afterwards, which was phenomenal. He never should have been able to do any of the things that he did physically, with the degree of injuries and wounds that he incurred on that ambush.
And that's what I'm hoping we can kind of touch base on is, well, one thing as we're leading into him going with the Ranger. I don't know. Some people may not know it. They may just know him as a hard charging Ranger, but Mike actually volunteered and was accepted after AIT to go to Special Force, the Q course or training group, and
Right.
Was in it. And I've got photos to prove it that you've provided. Sometimes there will be arguments saying, no, that's not true, not true. He's a Ranger. But we've got the candy stripe right here, training group picture. Can you, and this speaks to absolutely the type of man Mr. Mike is, or was, I should say, I apologize for that, that he found out midway through training, it's like, oh, first group, Oki's going to need some men, and more than likely, y'all are going to be Oki guys. Y'all aren't going to be going to Vietnam. He left training on with the chance, since he had already completed a phase or so, that he could come back and try again. He did not want to go to Okinawa. He wanted to go straight into the battlefield.
And the reason that was, and again, he enlisted before he graduated high school, so he was a pre-enlistee. There were two reasons. The lesser reason was his family had a military background. Ontario was heavily veteran, so that thought process was there. But the driving factor, as I've discovered, is that in 1969, his cousin, Joseph Ygnacio Echanis, who was an Air Force pilot and navigator, was shot down over Laos during a mission and was listed as being MIA. And Mike had been very close to Major Echanis, and he just, in his, as so many of us are at that, young age of our development and with that kind of a background, he felt that it was his duty to go to Vietnam, and if he could get into some kind of a special unit, he might be able to find out more about his missing cousin. Extraordinarily idealistic. So he had enlisted. He went to basic at Fort Ord. He went to AIT at Fort Gordon. At Fort Gordon, he tested for Special Forces. And this is another interesting thing. There's 3 other guys out of Ontario that all ended up in Special Forces. Chuck Sanders, of course, and then 2 other guys, one who is in Nova Scotia now as a physical therapist, interestingly enough, Tom. And Mike tested for Special Forces at Fort Gordon, did very, very well. Went on to jump school at Benning, and then went to Bragg, and he completed the first 2 phases of the SFQC. And this was at a time when the war in Vietnam for Special Forces was starting to wind down. And he and several others that were assigned to go to Vietnam, once they completed the course, were called in and told, you guys are going to be going to Okinawa to the first group, and because of this, that, and the other. And Mike and a couple of the other guys got together afterwards and said, I didn't come in here to go to Okinawa. I came here to go to Vietnam. And in Mike's case, the driving factor was, again, his missing cousin. So, and I talked to one of the other guys that interviewed him for the book, who did the same thing. They all went in and they all terminated the course. And Mike told the cadre why. And he was at the top of the class in first phase, second phase. And he was given the offer of, hey, we got it. That touches a chord in our hearts, that this is why you want to go, and this is a history. So, if you ever want to come back and finish the course, you're more than welcome to do that. The other fellow went confirmed all of that for me, and he ended up going to L Company Rangers. Mike went to, originally, when he terminated, his orders were sending him right to Vietnam. And that picture you showed of Mike, that was the day that he left Ontario and flew out for Vietnam after a 30-day leave at home. And he got over there. He was assigned to the 173rd. And from the 173rd, he immediately volunteered to go to a Ranger unit, and was accepted. And he finished the 1-week 173rd Jungle course, and then went up to Charlie Ranger and checked in there. And that was the beginning of what led him into that ambush at Ancre Pass. But that was the driver for Mike to get to Vietnam, and it was again a very idealistic young man, a young patriot who thought, if I can get over there, maybe I can find out something about my cousin, Major Echanis. And so, again, part of the myth, part of the legend, part of the story.
Absolutely. And he kind of, I didn't realize that the Rangers at that time were being, OpCon to, the fourth ID or the 173rd and stuff like that. And he, where was it? Right here. He takes place in a very large combat operation, April 19th, 20th, and 21st on into that, fighting the 95th NVA Regiment near Mang Yang Pass in Binh Dinh Province, South Vietnam, with the 3rd Battalion, 506th Infantry. So he was mixing it up, and unfortunately, as Mr. Greg alluded to, they get into a tizzy of a situation that sadly doesn't ruin Mr. Mike's career, but does ruin his military career. Could you speak a little bit? I know for the book you're going to have a lot more, and we don't want to give away everything, but could you kind of tell about what injuries and what he went through that day on going through the Ancre Pass and getting ambushed?
You bet. And this story is all documented, which had never been done before in terms of everything being pulled together. And I can't thank the Echanis family, particularly Pat Echanis, his mom, who kept everything that had to do with her son, and his medical records, his military records, the whole 9 yards. They communicated very closely up until the time of his death. Also, I got some significant help getting the actual Charlie Company documentation about that particular ambush, and that. Yeah, that's Pat. She passed away. I can't even remember now. 7, 8 years ago. Wonderful gal. You can see where Mike got his tenacity and his grit and his sense of humor. If you had ever met or known Pat, but what occurred was that Mike got to Charlie Company and went through the again the 1 week Charlie Company course for its folks, and they were in the process at that same time period of moving their what we would call today a FOB, or a forward operating base, from one location to another. And so Eddie Roberts and 3 other Rangers from the company and Mike who were detailed to go down to the new location and kind of, be the advance party, make sure everything's in place and, get it all ready for the company to move. And they traveled in a single deuce and a half through the Ancre Pass, which was Ambush Alley. And while they were coming through that pass, a full company NVA ambush was initiated on that truck. And long story short, everybody was wounded with the initial firing. The truck driver managed to keep the vehicle from going over the edge down into the pass, ran it off the road, kind of tilted on its side. The radio operator, assistant driver, was on the horn, letting everybody in the world know we're getting hit, we need help. And the incoming was so furious that Mike ended up being the only Ranger capable of fighting back. And so he was in the truck by the tailgate with his M16. Literally, the NVA started to assault the truck. He was literally described in his Bronze Star for Valor. shooting NVA troops at close range. He was hit in the forehead with one round, and then he was hit another 3 times in the lower legs and feet, and he still continued to fight. Now, this is a guy who had only been with that company for 4 months. I mean, this is definitely a new guy, and he had not seen this kind of combat at all. But again, the grit and who he was raised by, and that he just stayed in that fight until the initial relief force was South Korean, and then the relief force came in from Charlie Company, and I talked with the fellow that the officer at the time who was part of that relief force. And they got there, and the truck shot to hell. Everybody else is shot to hell. And Mike is standing, leaning up against the truck, holding his M16 in both hands, like this, and just shaking and crying. And the officer said, "You can, we're here. We're good. You're fine. We got medevac coming." He said, "You can give me your rifle now. You can give me your rifle." And he had to talk Mike into relinquishing the rifle. And Mike, before he relinquished it, grabbed his St. Christopher, because he's a staunch Catholic, and had been given a St. Christopher medal by his girlfriend at the time, Deborah, before he went to Vietnam. And he grabbed that, held the rifle in one hand, and he gave it to the officer. He said, "I'll give you my rifle, but I will not give you my St. Christopher." And just, phenomenal story. The documentation on that ambush, that was the most devastating ambush initiated on Charlie Company with the highest casualties during that time in the war. And Mike was put in for a Bronze Star with a V, which he received. He was put in for the Cross of Gallantry of Vietnamese, which he received, the Purple Heart, which he received, and several other decorations. But when they got him down to the field hospital, the determination was made that the wounds in his, I believe it was his right lower leg and foot, were so bad that they might have to amputate. And I've got the letter from the doctor to Pat. He had determined that Mike was just so young. And Mike, when he got to the field hospital, was back to being Mike the jokester, the prankster. Guys from the unit came by to visit him, and he was just a holy terror in the field hospital. The doctor said he was just so young, and he was just such an incredible personality. I couldn't bear to amputate that leg, that lower leg, and that foot. So he sent him to the hospital in Japan. And the hospital in Japan's doctor said pretty much the same thing. He might be able to at least keep the leg and the foot. So they sent him to Letterman Hospital back in the States there in San Francisco. And they were able to save the limb. He was in a body cast for 7 months. Chuck Sanders would go down. Chuck hadn't entered the military yet at that time. Chuck would go down and visit him and encourage him and that kind of a thing. And one of the great stories of the Letterman story, because it goes to Mike's whole thought process, was the doctors at Letterman said, "You're going to be able to keep the leg and everything, but you're never going to be able to walk again. You're going to have to wear a brace. You're going to have to use a cane." His wounds were so bad in the back of both calves that literally there wasn't much of either calf left. And folks that I talked to, Mike was very he did not like people to see the damage that had been done to his lower legs. But the few that did see it said it looked like, yeah, it just looked like somebody had cut the muscle off and stitched together with a stapler. And the wound to the foot took out a big chunk of his inner arch, as well as caused his toes to curl up, and he couldn't walk. And again, people I talked to that knew Mike, yeah, that's Mike at his original home in recovery. Basically, the damage done to that foot just precluded him from being able to do anything. Now, bear in mind, one, this is a young man. This is a young man who grew up hunting, fishing, who was a star basketball player, star track guy, and now he's being told he goes off to Vietnam and he comes back essentially, less than a year later, 100% disabled, crippled, to the little town of Ontario, Oregon. What is he going to do? And so he spent about 4 or 5 months in a very dark, very deep depression. He also had combat-induced PTSD, which PTSD was not identified at that time as being a war wound for the Vietnam veterans, and they were significantly, as a group, instrumental in seeing that change over the years for the rest of us. But Pat said that one day she was in the kitchen, and I've been in the house, which was a really, really fun, really interesting tour. She said Mike came up the stairs and leaned against the doorway, and he said, "Mom, will you go get me some desert boots?" And those were the soft leather shoes that were very stylish at the time, but very functional. And she said, "Mike, why do you want these shoes?" And he said, "Mom, because I'm going to learn how to walk again." And he could not wear. He had to wear something inside the shoe, and that was very uncomfortable. So he threw that away, and he took a pair of socks, rolled them up, and he would shove them up into that missing portion of the foot inside the shoe and lace it up, and that allowed him to be somewhat mobile. They had a pool table that his dad had put in down in the basement. Mike's room was just off the recreational area downstairs. And he went back downstairs and he started, just with his hands on the rail of the pool table, started walking around the pool table as best he could. And Chuck, again, very instrumental. Dr. Baker and Dr. Sanders, very instrumental in introducing him to weightlifting, encouraging him psychologically. Of course, Dr. Sanders, with his Marine Corps surgical experience in World War II, invaluable. They introduced him, got him on steroids to rebuild muscle tissue and strengthen.
Went from 123 to 200 pounds, I think, in a short time.
He went at his maximum weight was 240, and once he learned how to walk, and once Toshiro Nagato came over from Japan and started teaching judo to him and to Chuck, he just ignited. His whole focus was, to become a martial artist and to prove everybody wrong. And to go back to that, he's at Letterman Hospital. The doctor there tells him, "You're never gonna walk again. Take your disability pay and and go home and find something else to do." And he had told that to Chuck, and between he and Chuck, they said that ain't going to happen. So once he came out of the body cast and became just a little bit more mobile, and this is a true story. Chuck was down there visiting Letterman. The plan came together. He went and found the doctor that had said, "You'll never walk again." He said, "You need to come down to the track because they had a track there at the hospital area. Mike wants to show you something. And the doctor said, I'm too busy. What's he possibly going to show me, And Chuck said, no, you really need to come down to the track because Mike has something to show you. I said, look, I'm, too busy. And so Chuck made him go down to the track. Let's put it that way. And he got down to the track, and Mike was there on the track, and he said, I just want to show you something, Doc. And he limped, hobbled, kind of jogged a few steps all the way around the track one time. And got back and essentially, you're wrong. I am going to walk again. And for that, Chuck, of course, didn't receive any kind of disciplinary action because he was still a civilian. But Mike went from being a Spec 4 to a PFC, and which he could have cared less about at that point. But that was the relationship between Chuck and Mike that was so unique. And those of us who are in literally that kind of relationship comes up in the military, regardless of units that you're in, but especially in the combat arms. That's the beginning of No Fallen Comrade Left Behind. In my book, so to speak. And, from there, it was a long and arduous recovery period, but he did it. And of course, Chick helped him because Chick was still young and vibrant at that time. And that's how Mike Echanis became the Mike Echanis that we remember today. That also is the other impetus, and I talked with not a lot of people know there are two Mike Echanises. And there's Mike Echanis, who was known as Big Mike from Ontario, who was a cousin and went on to become a professor, lives in Pocatello. And I believe Mike is retired. But and then there was Little Mike Echanis and Big Mike, Little Mike. That's how they addressed him and told the difference. And I asked Big Mike, I said, what was the drive behind, because he was very close to Little Mike. And he said, Mr. Walker, he said, Mike knew that he was not prepared for what happened to him in combat in the Yankee Pass. And he determined that he was going to develop a program that would better prepare, particularly Special Forces soldiers, Special Operations soldiers, for that kind of experience. And that's exactly what he did.
What would you say? I believe there's Mr. Skip Crane. He's I believe in 75 he's gotten his first degree black belt. How soon is it by 1976 once the healing process to where because I believe Skip Crane's quoted by 75 from the healing process that his spin and back kicks were some of the most devastating things that he had ever seen personally. So how soon before he finally either is asked or begins making military contacts to be brought in for combatives training for the groups?
Real quick, Mike became exceptionally functional mobility-wise and coordination by 1970, late 72, early 73. He put his whole heart and soul into it, just his whole heart and soul. And again, he had such a great support network there in Ontario that he began training in judo with Toshiro and Chuck, and very rapidly began training in Taekwondo out of Boise, Idaho. He got his black belt very swiftly in TKD. He then started training as a boxer, and he fought amateur heavyweight at 240, six fights in the Boise area, won all six. Figured, okay, now I know how to box, and he just started knocking out the different arts that he found interesting and helpful. Again, going back to the judo and grappling, which is why that video that you brought up earlier is so critical. Mike introduced grappling and ground fighting to special forces back in 1970, late 75, 76, 77, and to the SEALs. I mean, he was the first multi-art military instructor in modern times that we saw in special forces and elsewhere. So when you watch that, you go, "Gee, that's a grappling move," or "Gee, that's a choke," or "Gee, that's a..." Yeah, he was already doing that stuff, and so that's what he took into that particular program, and just kind of went from there.
Did Mr. Mike meet the Norris brothers pre him starting the combatives, or did he meet them as he progressed in the combatives?
He met them after he'd been. Can't forget Harangdo, because that is what Mike is most known for. He went down to Los Angeles in, I'm pulling this out of the year, 70, 73. He had nothing. He was just training and going to everybody he could that he found might be reputable, and learning what he could. And he watched a television program with the Supreme Grandmaster now, Jubang Lee, with Jubang Lee was demonstrating. He had just come over from Korea. He was starting the second school, Harangdo school. His brother had opened the first one. And he was demonstrating the ability to control pain through the use of your mind. And so it's Jubang Lee who, in Harangdo, all of the driving the vehicle over the body, piercing, the skin, all of that stuff was part and parcel to Harangdo. And it was part of the training. And few people really know this, but all of Jubang Lee's black belts had to be able to do those, because they were demonstrations meant to say, look, this is what you can do once you develop your mind and can control your mind. And Mike saw that on TV and said, I got to meet that guy. And he wasn't so much interested in the Harangdo as a combatives program. He was interested in controlling the pain, because Mike did not get into opiates and that. He knew that that would be a bad thing. However, he did. He was a drinker, like so many of us were back, at least back in the day. And after he got home from Ontario because of the pain, he did start to smoke grass. So those are his two primary alleviators for the
Which
pain.
I'm a proponent of. I think our special forces guys should be able to do that, because I think the pain pills that are getting, because I mean they basically got their pharmacies at each group. I mean I think we need to get our special operators as far away from narcotics as we can, just for their, not only keeping them around on the teams, but for later wellness of life, because as you just said, it once you start those, it's just a downward trajectory.
And I've seen that. I went to work after my own recovery and rehabilitation in 2009. I went to work for the SOCOM Care Coalition as a DoD case manager and advocate, working out here on the West Coast and that. And I saw so many guys that became addicted to opiates and Percocet and morphine, which led to other problems and other issues, and killed far too many. But and again, that was a thing that Mike was kind of a pioneer in. Stay away from the opiates. But his pain levels were so bad. He also mentioned he'd been hit actually right between the eyes with a bullet fragment during that ambush, and he had chronic headaches, plus combat PTSD, plus the other wounds to deal with. And getting back on track with what we were talking about there, he went and sat outside Jubang Lee's little studio in Los Angeles for 3 days. And I interviewed Jubang Lee. I love the guy. His son, Taijun, is just wonderful as well. I actually had Dr. Lee do acupuncture on me twice because I've done acupuncture for many years, but I wanted to see because that's what Jubang Lee ended up doing for Mike in pain control. And Jubang Lee is an accomplished bone setter and acupuncturist. But he told me, he said, I'd come to the studio in the morning. And here's this guy. He's dirty. He's in dirty Levi's and a shirt, and he's sitting outside of my studio, and he says he wants to talk to me. And the first 2 days, he just stepped over him and went in and shut the door. Because at that time, this is the 70s, this is the hippies, this is all that stuff. And the third day he came by and he stopped, and there's Mike, first thing in the morning, sitting right there waiting for him. And he says, "What do you want? What do you want?" And Mike told him, and Jubang Lee said, "Come in." And he sat and talked with him. And what was interesting is that when Jubang Lee was originally from North Korea, and his family fled to the south. But during his time in Korea, he provided treatment for wounded South Korean soldiers. And so he knew, when he talked to Mike and listened to Mike, he knew what was going on. And Lee told me this. He said, I learned over time in South Korea that I could look into a soldier's eyes or a veteran's eyes. And he said, if I saw a red emission from the eyes, I knew they were suffering up here from what had happened to them, which we now call PTS. And he asked Mike, he said, "Will you show me your wounds?" And he said, Mike stood up and dropped his Levi's, and around both legs, he had a white hotel towel, rubber band tied around both legs, which were at that point still seeping, just really, really bad. And Jubang Lee said, "I'm going to help this guy." And what was unusual was Jubang Lee said, when I met soldiers that had what we call PTS now, he wouldn't train them, because what he was training, there's no sports aspect to Halangdo. And he taught deadly arts. And he said, I didn't want to train somebody who had this going on inside, in the arts and the weapons and everything else. But he said there was just something about Mike where he said, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to train this guy. And that's how Mike got into Halangdo. That's how Mike learned how mentally, when people say that Mike was into mind control, he was not into mind control in that super visual, the Men Who Stare at Goats movie thing. He was into learning how to shape and discipline and control your own mind so you could overcome, adversity. Mm-hmm. And he became extraordinarily proficient at this. And then he got into training in the arts of Halangdo, which was not real difficult because Mike was already a martial artist, was able to do a great many things. So Jubang Lee just really kind of created a system for Mike that fit what Mike wanted to do, and that and Zhu Li said, this is a guy, because he wanted to get into the U.S. military system with combatives. He said, this guy could do it. He's got the background, he's got the charisma, he's got the voice, he's got the look, he's got the, he's got the wounds, he's got the awards and decorations. And that's what led Mike into that whole combatives arena via Harangdo.
And it's as we're continuing on into some of the latter stages of his life. But as I said, guys, I'm going to link all of these to where you can see literally the 2 hours of the combatives course and everything. Well, not everything, but a good little view of what Mr. Mike was doing. And it's honestly stuff you would see guys today doing. I mean, it's hardcore, and most of the men, besides Mr. Chuck, his training partner, well, who was a Green Beret himself, Special Forces qualified, they were usually SEAL Team 2, the early CAG guys, Colonel Beckwith, and both Colonel Beckwith and Dick Marcinko heaped great praise upon Mr. Mike, both before and after his death. And if I'm not mistaken, Marcinko may have name checked him in his biography.
Dick and I met each other years ago. Actually co-wrote his transition book between his original writer, John Weissman, and some of the Rogue Warrior series that came out afterwards. I wrote Violence of Action for Dick. And I asked Dick before he passed away, I said, tell me about Echanis. Dick Marcinko was very close to then Master Chief Bob Nisley, who was the Navy liaison at Fort Bragg at the time, who was a MACV-SOG veteran, submariner. Bob and I became friends many years ago, and so he recounted all this, and he shared with me the documentation. He's a very, very close friend. And Dick was out at Bragg meeting with Beckwith, and that's where Marcinko got the idea for Delta to have a SEAL counterpart, which became SEAL Team 6. But at the time, he was the commander of SEAL Team 2 out at Virginia Beach. And one of the things he said is, he says, I want this Echanis guy to come out to Virginia Beach and train up some instructors like you have him training your people here. So he met Mike and asked him to come out there, which Mike did with Chuck Sanders in 1977. And they trained 3 classes of SEAL instructors. That's Bob and me. We were at Charlie Company, 7th Group in Florida, doing a visit there during one of my visits with Bob. Bob was a serious player. Not only was he the Naval Special Forces liaison at Fort Bragg at that time, but that was his cover. He was actually agency. And Mike, he was the guy who was the overseer, ran the team down in Nicaragua. And it was Beckwith who, in conjunction with Nisley, who oversaw that whole operation. And in 1982, Beckwith confirmed on ABC, and that link to that story is also on that website, that Mike, whenever Mike came back through Bragg, it was Beckwith that he reported to. This takes on a whole different thing when you get into that. And
that's what blew my mind, because getting into the story is and y'all see on Wounded Warrior, it's talking about, as Mr. Greg is about to get into, the 50,000 foot view of what's going on, and it's almost sounds like an ODA kind of setup. He's going to go down there and train, but he's running an intel cell for the president and a general. But as Mr. Greg just mentioned, also the CIA doesn't really have any network down there or anything, and at this moment in time, one could argue Mr. Mike was the closest person or closest American to the president of Nicaragua. So it as you said, it gets into a deep, murky CIA water here. It gets oh so interesting from here on out.
Yeah, it becomes Mike. And I've talked with some of those out there will recognize some of the names. Ray Molina, who was Cuban American, Bay of Pigs veteran, imprisoned by Castro, released, went on to, in 72, went down to Nicaragua, met Somoza, became Somoza's senior civilian advisor on a number of different things. And it was Molina who did the interview with Mike. They Somoza at that point, now we're talking 1977, did not trust his indigenous intelligence folks, and another player from Fort Bragg, who was then stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua, said, "You ought to just hire some of our guys as your own intelligence fusion cell and bring them down here, and they would report only to you." And Somoza said, "Well, you had anybody in mind?" He said, "Well, actually, I do." And Mike was the first to go down, and then Chuck followed, left Special Forces and followed down there, and then Bobby Nguyen ended up going down there as well. Joe Camp, who was one of Dick Marcinko's radio man during one of his tours in Vietnam. Later was a advisor operator with Phoenix. Yeah, that's Bobby right there with
Mr. Larry Trimble.
That's Larry Trimble, who I just saw soar again. Anyway, that was what the whole thing was a intelligence fusion cell in the fight against the Sandinistas, which was not going real well. And it was Beckwith and the chief that ran that whole operation on behalf of the agency up there at Fort Bragg. And again, you can't make this stuff up. It took all this time to get the documentation. A lot of people said Mike was not CIA. A lot of people said he was CIA. Nobody knew, just like the video. 2 years ago, and this is one of the I like the term supernatural. Every time that it seemed this story was over and that I could just write the book, somebody came out of nowhere who had a bit of information that was just critical. And it just, Pat experienced the same thing. It's just every time there was a dead end, all of a sudden an email, a phone call, a text message, just like with that video. Hey, I've had that for 15 years down here. Do you guys want to, holy crap.
Of course we
2.5 years ago, on an entirely different subject, I'm talking with the command historian out at Fort Bragg. And I had asked him, "Do you have, is there anything in the command historian on this?" The agency had cleaned it all out. They had literally nothing. And his stuff is all well documented, but there at the command historian, that had been cleaned out after the death. And he said, "Well, no, I don't. I really don't. But I did. I did see a document about him being with the agency." I went, "What?" He says, "Yeah." So that led to another inquiry, and sure enough, I got a copy of the document. It came from when Pat had requested her son's 201 file after his death, because she wanted to make sure that all of his awards and decorations were accounted for and everything else. And Pat knew that they had been assassinated. And that's a whole nother story in the book that nobody really knows about in terms of how she knew that. But on that one piece of paper, it said it's got all of Mike's stuff, document, and it says, looking for this. And on the bottom, and God bless the most powerful individual in the United States Army, and that's a records clerk, a unit clerk. And anybody that's been in knows that's true. Your company records clerk can, make or break you. And on the bottom, the guy had written, I don't have access to his 201 file. That's with the agency because, or actually, that's with the CIA because that's who he worked for. And there it is, baby. That's it.
Smoking gun right there.
And that led to confirmation that Chuck also had been brought on board. That's why one of the reasons that he left Fifth Group. Joe Camp was a longtime agency guy. And those that are familiar with the Wall of Heroes at the CIA's headquarters, there are 3 dates for 1978. And of course, the Wall of Heroes is pretty much there's anonymous. Now, some other authors have identified some of those that are on the wall. 1978, there's only 3 that are on the wall that are not identified. And those 3 are Mike Echanis, Chuck Sanders, and Joe Camp. And so, yes, that's who he was working for. That's he had mixed feelings about working for the agency, but that's what you had to do if you were going to play. And that's yet again another one of those things that solidifies Mike's life and what he accomplished.
I mean, for him to be brought in such a manner like this and be the only, well, yeah, I mean, I feel pretty safe saying it now with the information being the agency's only way to keep an eye on what the president was doing, what he was thinking day to day, was Mr. Mike. I mean, that's got to be, a huge feather in Mr. Mike's cap for being able to do all of that. But also, as you said, it opens just a whole new can of worms about the assassination. He had kind of gotten into something. I'm sure he knew there was something going on, but he kind of got in between a power struggle between 2 generals.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Yeah, it's and that's just I've talked. He had met General Somoza's son at Fort Bragg when he was when the son was going through the foreign officer course, the FAIL course, and of course Nisley. They all knew Tachito, and again the book is very detailed on how this all came about. But when Mike got down there, he already had an intro through Tachito. He already had an intro through Skip Crane. Skip is a very dear friend, and it was just invaluable in helping with not only Mike but with Joe Camp, who was the first of that team who was killed several months before the assassination of Mike, Chuck, and Bobby, and General Allegret. But Mike got down there, and the Skip was assigned to the embassy down there, and in his role, of course, Skip Crane is I call Skip a legendary SEAL officer, Vietnam, and in many other places, and one of the nicest men you could ever meet. But Mike came down. He signed into the Mill Group, which meant that he was not down there as just a quote mercenary for Somoza. He was part of the U.S. Mill Group at the embassy. That's who administrated his stuff with the agency contact down there, and there was hardly any CIA presence in Nicaragua at that time. They were shutting down things. It was getting too hot. They were moving people around. And So Mike was introduced to Somoza through Tachito, and Somoza just took an instant liking to this guy, and Mike literally could go in and see Somoza pretty much anytime he wanted to, because one of the things he was doing was he was training an 80-man commando force, which was nicknamed the Black Berets, which was essentially a strike force, and it was a counter-terrorist force, and again. I've got all of the documents with equipment and soft goods that were ordered and everything. Everything was funneled. A lot of things were funneled through Bob Brown at Soldier of Fortune, who at that time, Tom Cunningham, who was a SOG veteran who was working for Bob, and Tom was Mike's point of contact in Boulder to fulfill things that Mike and Chuck believed that they needed for down there. I mean, it just gets bigger and bigger. So as Skip described it, he said, we didn't know what Somoza was doing. We didn't have anybody close to Somoza, and he was becoming more and more paranoid as the Sandinistas and as the Carter administration and the State Department continued to pull the rug out from under him. And he said that Mike was the only guy that could go in and talk to Somoza and then come back and tell us what was really going on. Now, Somoza knew that Mike was doing that, but that was how the game was played. And so a lot of information that Somoza may have been passing to Mike was, meant to go to Mike. And some of it, obviously, especially the ground truth on the battlefield, Mike firsthand collected. Ray Molina told me that he would submit handwritten intelligence reports, and Molina, let's put it this way, Bob Nissley told me, if Ray Molina is talking to you, then you're getting the straight stuff, because Molina knows it all.
Wow.
And Molina told me, he said the intelligence reports that Mike would write for us, he said, were some of the most incredible intelligence reports I've ever seen. And he said, and they were spot on. So he more and more, along with his unit, became integral in the fight, the last couple of years' fight against the Sandinistas. That unit, by the way, there was a patch made that Mike designed, which Tom Cunningham graciously sent me one of. And the other thing was they were so good in the field that when in '79, when Somoza left the country and the Sandinistas took over, that company was pre-positioned in southern Nicaragua and up by the capital. And half of that company, yes, that's the patch for that unit. Half that company took its weapons and everything else and went across the border into Costa Rica and surrendered to the CIA. The other half crossed the Gulf of Fonseca over to El Salvador to La Union, which I worked out of years later. So I know what was there and how close it was to Nicaragua. They surrendered to the agency over in El Salvador. They ended up becoming the core combat advisors, trainers, and leaders for the Contra Wars. And I had, who knew? But it was Mike and Chuck and Bobby and Joe Camp that had equipped, trained, run on the ground with, and developed that particular unit to the degree, of course, Mike had access to Delta. He knew the training stuff, as did Chuck. And that's what they created. And it went on to, fight against the Sandinistas during the Contra War.
If I'm not mistaken, as we're getting ready to kind of start winding things down, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I thought I remember either Gosh, was it Colonel or General? Is it Genie, or is there a different pronunciation to it? Samuel Genie or
Yep, Samuel.
Genet Genie? Uh, he made it sound like in his thinking that Allegret was getting ready for a coup, and he had all he needed with Mr. Mike and Chuck and the 80 men they had trained, that they could take the country over within a week, a month.
Yeah, they were the General Allegret, and I go into in depth on this in the book. Mike got seconded to Allegret's command because he had a run in at the National Training Center, the EEVI, with a Nicaraguan captain who he put his hands on. And down south, you do not put your hands on a Central American officer, regardless of who you are.
Mm.
And so, and he had a reason for it, but it wasn't a real good reason. And so he was kicked off Ebi. He could not go to Ebi anymore. So Somoza put him with Allegret, who had been with Somoza forever. And in August of '78, the Allegret represented a portion of the Nicaraguan officer staff that just felt Somoza was not going to win this war. He was too soft on the Sandinistas. I go into why that was in the book. And there was a coup that was to be mounted. Genie's was the conventional intelligence head. He was in opposition to Allegret, who now had Mike and that team as the intelligence people. And they arrested 80 some officers and enlisted men in August, and Allegret was named as being the head of this. And I talked with Ambassador Salon, interviewed him on this because he met with Allegret several times. And Allegret was kind of feeling his way. What happens if Somoza's not here? Anyway, Somoza and Genie got wind of that, and Mike was flying down to the commando base in southern Nicaragua in September, because the Sandinistas had come across the border with about 300 people. And Allegret said, "I'll fly down there." And I've got Ray Molina told me this about this meeting because he was there. It was at that time they decided. Allegret says, "I'm going to fly down there and find out what's going on," because they didn't trust the phone lines at all. So Mike went with him. Chuck went with him. Molina was supposed to go, but was called back to Somoza's office and said, "I need you." Somoza said, "I need you back here. I need to talk to you about something. And I can't talk to you about it over the phone." Well, what he was doing is he was getting Molina out of that aircraft. Bobby came down and drove Chuck down to meet Allegret and Mike there at the airport. And because Molina wasn't going, they asked Bobby, "You want to go along, Bobby?" And Bobby said, "Yeah, sure." That's how Bobby got into that aircraft. That aircraft had a explosive device placed in it down at the commando camp. Somoza and Genie knew about that flight 24 hours before it went down there. So Genie was able to arrange for the device to be in place. And that's what exploded. It was placed up in the aerial commander in a small storage compartment right behind Allegret. And Mike and Bobby was sitting behind Allegret. Mike was in the passenger seat, and Chuck was in the back passenger seat next to Bobby. And that device was detonated as they were returning to Managua. And again, this is one of those things. I was introduced to Mike's fiance, Nicaraguan fiance, went down and spent 3 days with her and her husband in Southern California. She had all of the stuff. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful woman. her, at the time, brother-in-law was a physician at the Nicaraguan military hospital when the bodies were recovered, and he was able to tell me exactly what the injuries, the damage, and everything was. He's in Texas now. He's been in Texas for years, has his own practice. So again, all of the stories about this, that, and the other thing. Mike, Chuck, and Bobby were collateral damage. The point was to get Allegret. And then it was Somoza who turned around and had custom caskets built for all three and ensured that they were returned to the United States. This is a whole different story, an incredible story. And ultimately for burial up in Ontario with the Special Forces commander at the time alerting Jake Jakovenko's ODA to go out there and be the color guard. So anybody that doesn't think that Mike Echanis wasn't beloved and part of Special Forces or the Special Forces community simply doesn't know the story. And but yeah, they hit him, and they hit him hard. And but a year later, the country fell.
Man, it's I know personally, I will be just thoroughly excited for when the book comes out, because you've gotten enough out there in the articles that I'll be posting to get you sitting on the edge of the seat and hoping there's another article about to pop up, because ranging from his early life, very interesting, but as he picks up steam, Special Forces and Rangers, it just progressively gets more interesting. His story of perseverance is unlike really any that I've personally heard about, with his recovery and being able to come back. One could argue better than he was before, if that's even possible, and continuing to serve his country the way he did. It's just going to be an outstanding book, and one could foresee. I know I could. There being a biography movie on Mr. Mike one day. I mean, he would be the perfect movie character for the Vietnam era that I can picture. I would love to see that. Quite frankly, that would be a good one.
Well, a couple very quick things before we jump off here. There, I think are just critical. One, Mike did meet in Virginia Beach Chuck Norris and Aaron Norris, and he did end up teaching at Norris's Hilltop School at that time. He only taught black belts. Did it in the evenings when he wasn't up at Camp AP Hill or at Virginia Beach training the SEALs. And he became very close friends with Aaron Norris, Chuck's brother. And that was always a thing of contention out there in the myth world of Michael Echanis, but it is absolutely true. And 2 years ago, Mike's sister Liz, his younger brother Cam, another family member, and myself, we went down to the Norris Invitationals in Las Vegas, and at the banquet, Mike was awarded posthumously a 5th degree black belt in the Norris system. They have never awarded a posthumous belt to anybody, and as Aaron told me, he said, and we probably never will again. But his impact on the Norris system was so, because he taught real world combatives to them. Those ended up in Norris's movies, which made them more realistic. And plus, he was just he was their friend and their brother, and they loved him dearly. So he was honored there. Last year, Toshiro Nagato came over from Japan. He is now the lead soke for the ninjutsu folks over there, the true ninjutsu school. and Toshiro came over, and I went to the seminar that he taught. He and Mike were very, very close, and Toshiro granted Mike and his memory the title of Daishi, which is above ninth degree black in a lot of systems. So my point here being a great deal of this research was spent correcting the mistaken ideas, the lies, the exploitation of Mike's persona by certain people, and getting his lineage, his heritage in order. And that'll be, of course, part and presented in the book. The last one, and I always bring this up, there was a book that was published in 2014 called American Warrior, the story of a legendary ranger, written by Gary O'Neill and David Fisher. And I've interviewed Gary O'Neill for Full Contact magazine when I was doing that publication years ago. I thoroughly expected that O'Neill would do Mike's service justice because he was on Jakovenko's team. That's where he met Mike. Chuck Sanders, of course, was the junior medic on that team. When that book came out and I read that book, I was shocked. I was horrified. Gary O'Neill stole and misrepresented and outright lied about Mike from almost the first chapter. He denigrated his service in Vietnam. He made no mention of the ambush in the Anke Pass and the Valor Awards. He just absolutely, throughout the whole book, what he was doing is that he was capitalizing on Mike's name and his very limited, association with Mike. All the way up until the point that he ended up being down in Nicaragua with Mike and another fella who he just strap hung with him. And I've called Gary out on this. He offered that he was there at the body recovery. He was not. He offered that he, afterwards, after they were killed, he got ambushed, and then Somoza told him, go out and get those bad guys that did this to everybody. You can watch that movie. Steven Seagal made it years ago. I think it was Out for Justice or something. Horrible. And it took a year to counter every single lie that O'Neill tells in that book, to include, I've got all of the message, State Department, government, embassy, cable traffic, as to where Gary O'Neill actually was and what he was actually doing, which was returning from his wedding up at Fort Bragg. And I interviewed his ex-wife, Kim, who was just a lovely woman, who said that book is just, she said, I'm so ashamed of Gary for doing that to Mike and to Chuck.
I mean, the egregious one that caught my attention was him saying he found out Bobby didn't have an American flag or something, and he held up the funeral so he could drive 120 miles to go get an authentic American flag so Bobby could be buried, because Jake and ODA 594, the scuba team, didn't bring one and weren't there to represent them. And evidently he didn't know the entire ODO showed up to be the color guard. So when I saw that, I was just like, this is not going to be good right off the bat in this book.
Yeah, it's that is a complete and total fabrication. O'Neill showed up with Kim at the funeral services. He tried to make an issue about Bobby because he knew he'd met Bobby in Nicaragua, because Bobby was working with Mike and Chuck, of course. And again, Bobby left SOG, became a warrant officer in the South Vietnamese Army, then became a captain. He was the commander of the company that held Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon until it was overrun by the North Vietnamese. He then led a breakout of his company to the coast, sailed out to the 7th Fleet, and then ends up in ends up at Fort Bragg again. This guy, it took so much to find out about Bobby, but once the door was opened by Larry Trimble, Gene Pugh, Willie Merkelson, just a cadre of people, to denigrate Bobby's memory with this BS story about I wanted to ensure that an American flag was on Bobby's casket. Well, at the time, Bobby wasn't an American citizen. And Jake Jakovenko is the one who told O'Neill there, he's not an American citizen. He's not getting a flag over this, his casket. And that's just the way that Jake was brought up. And Jake was a Ukrainian immigrant. So, he came into the country, the proper way. And O'Neill had a flag. And what he did is that when they all passed in front of the open graves of Bobby and Mike, the Jake and the team dropped their berets into Mike's grave on top of the casket, and O'Neill threw the American flag into Bobby's grave, and it was soon gone after that. He was not highly considered or thought of, especially by the Echanis family. And long story short, anybody that's read that book, anything in there on Mike Echanis, other than the fact that Gary O'Neill knew him, is either exaggerated, concocted, outright lied about, and for the most hideous and terrible of reasons. I will say this because it's important about Bobby. Bobby was a martial artist. He was a black belt in Taekwondo, combat Taekwondo in Vietnam. He was an instructor after he had left SOG and that, become an officer. And when Bobby's casket showed up on Ontario with Chuck's and Mike's, the Echanis family had no idea who it was. They had no idea that it was coming to them. And that's a whole nother story that's in the book, how that happened and why. So Pat was talking with Chief Nisley, who had gone out there to coordinate all of the funeral arrangements. And I have all of those documents. And Pat said, who is this guy? Who's Bobby? And Nisley told her who Bobby was. And she said, well, if Bobby was a friend of Mike's, then Bobby's going to be buried with Mike. And now bear in mind that Chuck was Protestant, so he was cremated. His ashes were spread over his favorite mountain range here in Oregon. But his grave marker is with his family at the Protestant cemetery. The Echanis is a Catholic. And so Mike was being buried essentially in the plot. Chick Kime, as a matter of fact, is buried about 3 graves down from Mike. So Pat, and I got this from Pat, and I got it from Frank Echanis, Mike's dad, before he passed. They had to go to the Catholic Church there and get permission to bury Bobby there. And Pat said she had just replaced her mother's tombstone with a new one. And so she had the tombstone for her mother recut, repolished, and reinscribed for Bobby. These are the kind of people that raised Mike Echanis. And Frank went to the priest who was apparently kind of a rogue. And as Frank told me, he said, I sat down, I explained what was taking place, and we wanted to bury Bobby with Mike. And the priest said, well, Frank, was Bobby Catholic? And Frank, of course, they knew nothing about Bobby. And Frank mused, and this is a Basque family, which was integral to Mike's upbringing and that. An amazing culture and people. And Frank looked at the priest and he says, Father, I don't know that Bobby was Catholic, But I do know that a lot of Vietnamese are Catholics, and the priest said,
Good for me.
good enough for me, and signed off on it. And so that picture you showed of Bobby's tombstone there, his marker, he is buried along with Mike. And that grave it's ever since been cared for by the Buddhist community in Ontario. And of course, every time that I go, and some of the other guys that were affiliated with this go by to pay their respects, we always leave an American flag at Bobby's gravesite. Post it there, a little bitty one with Mike and one with Chuck, and it's quite the story. The tail end of that story, John Paget, MACV-SOG, you know who Paget is. Paget wrote a memorial for Bobby in 1982 in Soldier of Fortune. It is the cornerstone of what I was able to then build upon to find out who Bobby was. Paget thought that Bobby was still at the bottom of Lake Nicaragua. Gene Pugh thought he was still there. Larry Trimble, CCN, RTASP, thought he was still there. When they were all informed at different times that Bobby's buried in Ontario, especially Gene at SOAR 20, this last year's SOAR, because Gene was really close to Bobby, as I learned. They were emotionally just overwhelmed because they loved that guy. They said he was the funniest, the most efficient. When he was in the field, he could smell the Viet Cong. He'd walked us away from ambushes we never would have known were there. Just a wonderful young man, and clearly a hero in his own right as a South Vietnamese airborne officer. And
it's kind of hard not to be, because if you think about it, and I'll be showing you the story. And guys, if you're looking for a good book on the very early start of CCS, this is by Lee Wade, who wrote a book on his A-team, Tan Phu. But this is the start of CCS when it was called C5. And Bobby is actually mentioned in this. If you follow my Instagram or Facebook, that's where this story came from. And he was literally picked up at a whorehouse at 13 or 14 years old. And from then on out was raised by special forces and SOG men. So he grew up speaking French, Vietnamese. He learned Spanish, I'm sure, from Mr. Gene and some other people before Panama. Perfect English. I mean, it's a testament to all of you SF men as well. I mean, that's the reason he ended up the way he did, because of y'all raising him. I mean,
yeah, the guys from that era and that generation, and the SOG and the Mike Force, and that, that's where it soared when General Beauray spoke and honored his interpreter, the last surviving member of his, and that story is now in the Sentinel, if you want to post the link, and gifted Nguyen his 2-star beret upon retirement. I mean, that is what SOG was about. That is what Special Forces is about, is never forgetting, never leaving behind, always going the extra mile for your indigenous personnel who would live and die for you and with you. And you see it in Afghanistan, Iraq. This is that story. And Larry Trimble is this spring is going to go out to Ontario and pay his respects to Bobby. It is, I mean, you can see this story is so much more than a guy who could kick and punch. The lives he touched, and the careers he saved at Fort Bragg, because he also taught healing at Fort Bragg. He had guys come to him. He knew so many SOG guys, as I've learned. He knew so many of the legends.
Dick Thompson being one.
And he was a dual personality. His public face was very loud and very, that was the public Mike Echanis. The private Mike Echanis, particularly in talking to Skip Crane when he was with him down in Nicaragua, very quiet, very polite, very unassuming, just a regular guy. But he's a fascinating story. Has his Chuck, has his Bobby, has his Joe Camp, Beckwith, Marcinko. Who knew? And I'll end it with this. Before this broadcast started, remember or during the broadcast, I said things just kind of happen that have, that's why it's 15 years in the making. I have never seen a picture of Bobby at that age until you and I talked right before we went live, and you said, "Hey, Lee Wade," who I know who Lee Wade is, and that picture that's in Lee's book is the earliest picture that I'm aware of Bobby, and it will definitely be in the book. And for those that don't know, Bobby's parents lived in North Vietnam, and they were both killed by the NBA. That's how Bobby was orphaned. His dad was French, his mom was Vietnamese, and that's how Bobby became an orphan, and an orphan that was adopted and honored by Special Forces and by MACV-SOG. I would never have seen it or known about it until you asked me if I'd like to do this podcast. And that's how this has gone. So thank you.
And we wouldn't have. I would have eventually found it, and this will lead to the next question before we go. I wouldn't have ever found it because I was literally flipping through books, getting ready to pick out my next victim, shall we say, book I was going to read. And I got to the end and just so happened to see Bobby and young South Vietnamese kid. And I said, there's not many Bobbies that are South Vietnamese that worked with MACV-SOG as an interpreter. And I kept reading and reading. And then sure enough, it was y'all's Bobby and the photo, which I showed, but it's here. Guys, that's a great book to get on early SOG, but I would have never found it if I wasn't flipping around. And I'm so glad it's almost fate working here that photo was meant to be in your book, because that is other than Mr. Larry and him side by side, that is the youngest photo I've ever seen of him.
Yeah, and the thing of it is some call it fate, and as will be in the book and described in detail. That is Mike Echanis' spirit, wanting to have the true story, the real story about so many, to include himself, set straight. And his sister and his mom are the one. I didn't create that thought process. His sister and his mom have both said the same thing. She said Mike has not been at rest ever since his death because of what took place and what happened. And there's so many reasons why this book never should have happened, could have happened, would have happened. But once Pat said, let's do the book, all of a sudden, this stuff started to take place and happen and to fall into place. So it's really been a journey of respect. And I have to say, I have to thank every person I've talked to and met who have invited me into their homes, into their lives, have brought up memories that were sometimes very painful, to be in a position to help correct things and say, well, that as with Paget and the guys, no, Bobby's here in the States. He's buried in Oregon. This book would not be possible without them. I am truly just the messenger, and I've been blessed throughout my entire career to live and to meet and to walk amongst the giants in our community, and I remind myself of that, every day. So it's quite the thing. I think people will truly enjoy the book. And I'm going to share one last thing with you for fun. when Charlie Beckwith and Bob Nisley became very, very close friends for a number of years. And again, they were very involved in this mission down in Nicaragua and Mike's stuff with Delta. They would get together in their offices after work, and Beckwith drank wild turkey. He would only drink wild turkey. Bob was, a little bit more flexible, and Beckwith would always had a silver flask that he would drink wild turkey from. And when Nisley got transferred or PCS'd in 1979, they had a very nice party for him, gave him a very nice plaque. The agency gave him a very nice plaque, which I have. And Beckwith, according to Bob, slipped up behind him and slipped that flask into his pocket and said, "This is for you, my friend." And that flask had Beckwith's name engraved on it. And then he had, he didn't name him, of course, because he was, but he had Master Chief engraved underneath his name. And when Bob passed away, he left it to me.
Holy cow. Look at, I mean, that thing is pristine.
It is just that. It is, for me, it is such an honor. Bob, as I said, Nisley and I met years and years ago under different circumstances. We're very close friends. Bob knows the whole story, knew the whole story. He's buried in Lander, Wyoming now. But I'd go to his house in Panama City in the evenings. We sit around and sip, and he told me the story of that flask. And then after he passed and that arrived from his family, it has an honored place here in my home. And only wild turkey will ever be in it.
Gotta keep it clean in Mr. Beckwith's terms. If that's what he wanted and drank, you got to follow his lead and keep it wild turkey.
There it is. And this flask, I've already talked with General Beauray on this. Beauray, of course, was Delta, as well as SOG and so many other things. At some point, and it'll be before I pass, unless it's instantaneously, this flask will be donated to the compound out in Bragg to the Delta guys because it is their lineage and their history. So from me, it will go back to where it needs to be. And Beauray has already kind of laid the pathwork for that to happen.
It needs to be right up there next to Walt Shoemate's mustache that's still up there on the wall. And speaking of Walt Shoemate, as we're closing out, there is the question we're all wanting to know, especially for people that just came in. When did you say you were thinking the book will be coming out? And when it does, will there be Audible editions?
Will there be what?
Audible, the electronic, the ebooks.
I just let Liz know because she took over for Pat in terms of overseeing this effort. It will be finished here in 2025. I hope to have it published at the end of this next year. I've been motivated to do that because a dear friend of mine, Gordon Dennison, is just finished his 15-year journey writing the end-all book on Mad Dog Jerry Schreiber, which I've seen the mock-up of, but Gordon brought it out to SOAR several years ago. And I talked to Gordon last week. I said, "Is your book finished?" Because he goes, "It is. It's coming out the first quarter of 2025. I finally, going to let it go." And so mine will follow that towards the end of 2025. And as I shared with Liz and a couple other folks, I've written a number of books and I've written biographies before, and they take a year or 2 years. This has been a labor of love. This has been a journey that has fascinated me. And one of the things I found, I'd hoped to finish it, last year. I hope to finish it this year. As with Gordon, you become so close and you learn so much and you correct so many things that were wrong or lies or fabrications. You meet, more importantly, you meet so many incredible people, girlfriends, former wives, children, that there's a part of it. I know this half of the Gordon we shared. There's a part of you that just doesn't want it to end because you become afraid of losing those connections and the joy that you feel when you you get something right. And so with Gordon finishes his book, that's a signal to me to wrap this up, get it under hardcover. Yes, it will definitely set it up to be a Kindle book or an audio book. The timing again of all of this could not be better because again, from 100,000 feet, the new administration, Mike Echanis' story is a story that our country needs to have available and read now. Mm-hmm. And it'll have a great audience because of who we have brought back in office and the changes that are going to be made to so many things, to include our military. So to answer your question, yes.
Excellent. I know I'm looking forward to both of these, and Gordon, looks like it's going to be actually a two-parter for the Mad Dog book. There's going to be a volume 1 and a volume 2, and I've heard he had to do 2 volumes because he's going to have a lot of photos that we've never seen of Jerry before, including some of his own from his tour. So if you can get it, guys, you better get it while it's getting, because I heard it'll be a pressing, but depending on how it goes, there may be a single pressing. So when you see it on sale, you better grab it if you want it, because it'll go quick.
It's a remarkable book. As I said, many of us saw the mock-up of it at SOAR several years ago, and immediately put ourselves on the list to get one. The thing with Gordon is he knew Shriver.
Yeah.
And he was a Cobra pilot and flew support. And again, the Shriver, the hook got into Gordon, and years later he said, I got to write this guy's story. And Shriver's sister, who the Shriver family's up in Seattle area, and that's where Jerry's marker is. He was finally declared as dead, but body never recovered as of yet, but they're still looking for it. And Jerry's sister, as Pat did with me, she decided Gordon was an honorable guy and would do a good job, and she gave Gordon, Jerry had sent everything home, pictures, letters. Gordon has his beret. I have Mike's beret, as a matter of fact, which is, just a real honor. But Gordon's book on Jerry is just going to be, a milestone. And it's, again, written for all the right reasons. And it's just really something.
It's going to dispel a lot of rumors throughout that have accumulated on Jerry, and finally put some of the nonsense to rest and give you a great insight on who the actual man was. So much like your book with Mr. Mike and the guys. So I know I'll be looking forward to both of y'all's releases with anticipation that I'll be having to sit on my hands to keep from going crazy. Well, it looks like we have just hit the 2-hour mark. We've had a great show. In fact, people are already saying they'd love to have you back on if we can get a show together on something else, or maybe when the book comes out, you can come on and promote the book, or right before it comes out, you can promote it and give it a push.
I'd be happy to.
Excellent. Well, if that's that's about all I've got today. Are you ready to close out, sir?
I'm ready to pull pitch, brother.
All righty.
And
Well,
and and thank you, bud. You have turned this podcast in honor of the SOG guys into just an incredible platform. You're doing such a good job with it, and I know so many of the guys have reunited and linked back up because of you're doing this. So thank you.
without you guys coming on and trusting me and feeling open to talk, I'd be nowhere. So the thank is just right back at y'all for being so gracious with your time and y'all's personal history to share with me and the fans and all of that. So we appreciate y'all more than y'all know.
Yeah. Take
So
good care, bro.
you too, and give those puppies and kitties some love, and I'll be in touch with you to get you a copy to where you can post this on the Warriors of Night page.
Yeah, again, anybody that's would like to get caught up, the Warriors of the Night Facebook page is out there. There is an enormous amount of information. It's backstopped. It's documented. There's pictures that have never been seen before. There's, of course, the ABC or the ABC video, NBC, and then the long lost Mike Echanis program tape, which is classic.
I will have all of that linked in the show note, guys. I know it wasn't in there at the start, but if y'all come back in about 15 minutes, I'll have a slew of Mr. Mike clips and articles on him that y'all can go through. So give me about 15 minutes to get everything edited and all of that, and it will be up to where y'all can come check it out. So without further ado, I think we can say we successfully completed our mission today. So we're gonna call it a day. And Mr. Greg, thank you for stopping in with us, and we will see you later on.
All right, brother. Take good care.
Yes, sir. Bye bye.